whip speeches. First of all, before we begin, does anyone have any like particular questions or things that they think are really important, or that like things that they themselves struggle with doing in whipping that they want me to go through in more detail?
How do you structure a whip speech?
Yeah.
Yeah, just like the same point as before, just how do you point out over the other team on your side of the keyboard?
Yeah.
Grouping lots of substantive from several teams into specific clashes.
Sure.
How do you tread the line between showing you're more important than your top half and then just accidentally explicitly rebutting them?
How do you like identify like what the points of clash are without just sort of getting sidetracked by non-important things?
Sure. Okay, so I think the first thing to talk about is probably the sort of the purpose of your whip speech, or what happens when you come up to the podium to speak. Because thinking it through, it obviously depends slightly whether you're gov whip or op whip, and those differences we'll talk about in due course. But as we said earlier, in an ideal world, your partner has made some kind of substantive contribution to the debate. They've made a bunch of arguments. They might have explained a little bit why it's relevant or important, but like, as in, hopefully at this point, the judges haven't, as long as the judges haven't just assumed that you're just completely dead because your entire extension was ludicrous. At this point in the debate, you're probably still lying to a degree. And the question then is, how do you slowly pull yourself up the rankings? So, a couple of things you need to do. First thing is rebut both teams on the other side of the bench. The second thing you need to do is explain what your extension was, why it's super important, why it's debate winning. And part of that will be explaining why that contribution is more important than the team in opening. So I think there are a couple of ways that you can go about this, and probably structure is a decent place to start. So there are various structures that people use. I think, if you feel like in the debate you can understand very readily what the clashes are, so maybe you doing a debate that's like, I don't know, legalizing all drugs, and you might be like, look, clearly there are two broad areas in this debate. One, like, say you're gov whip, like, or regardless of which side you're on, there's probably going to be a bunch of chat about like the principled right that people may or may not have to access drugs. And there'll be another question about like the sort of safety, a kind of, if we accept, probably like ease of access probably comes into it partly, and then a subsidiary of that is like damage to people. So the sort of, if you take heroin that's like clean and government funded, that's probably better for you than taking heroin that's like, cut with rat poison or something. So you can kind of work out broadly, and this is something that you're probably going to be able to work out before the debate even begins, like what generally people are likely to talk about in this debate. You should also, hopefully, before the debate begins, have an idea about the kinds of things your partner is likely to say, or where you are trying to jump in on that sort of set of things. So this will inform the particular weighting you give to any one of those things. But the first way you can structure your speeches is just by going through generally all of the issues in the debate, and you probably want to go through them in a relatively, in an order that makes sense in the abstract. So you can probably differentiate, do people have a principled right to have drugs or not, probably sits apart from the various questions of practicality about whether banning it makes it easier or harder for people to get access to this, whether there's a bunch of ancillary harms about like gang crime, whatever. Those two things seem like intuitively separate because they're arguing sort of from different start points and trying to reach different endpoints, so you can split it up in that way. And then within those arguments, you want to sort of, if you were walking through from the very first most base principles about the world to, and therefore you should vote for our side, the order that you give your speech, or the order your point should be walking people through that. So here is why, banning drugs actually leads to, doesn't necessarily deter people. We explain that probably an equivalent number of people on both sides of the house will want drugs and will seek out drugs. And then you say, prove that. Given that, the question is, the drugs that these people are likely to get, are they nice, clean drugs? Are they bad rat poisoning drugs? Explain why you care about that, why that matters, so on and so forth. And then you can bring in sort of, and given that all of these things are true, here are an additional set of harms of, sort of doing this policy related to criminals and all of that jazz, whatever the motion is. So generally when you're structuring it through the sort of theme of clashes, you're trying to go through walking the judge through, if you believe each one of these statements in turn, you will reach the logical conclusion that closing opposition has won this debate. Second way you can do your structure in whip is the intellectually lazier but sometimes more useful structure, which is to just be like, say you're closing gov, be like, okay, 3 points in this speech. Firstly, closing op. Secondly, opening op. Thirdly, us. And you just kind of ignore your top half because that comes slightly into the us thing. So you kind of most likely, and so the reason why I would put it that way is because closing op are the ones that have literally just talked. So, and the sort of your extension of whatever your extension is hopefully going to be pitched at a level that is intuitively better than your openings. And when you explain what your contribution is, you're going to also be explaining why that beat your opening. It is probably necessary before you explain your sort of contribution and why it's debate winning to have resolved any other clashes. So you can be like, look, opening up made this set of arguments, so explain why they're not true, why they're not important, why they're relatively small. And then you go, and now, so you sort of beat closing op's extension, whatever that was, you explain why opening up stuff isn't that important, isn't that likely, and you go, okay, so you sort of, the rest of the debate has been made kind of small and insignificant, and then you go, aha, and here is our extension, and now I'll explain why it was the best thing ever and why it totally won the debate. So that is a way you can also structure your speeches, and sometimes it's easier, particularly when you're starting out, to structure them in that way, just because it's just kind of easier to have like, all the things closing up said, all the things opening up said, and then all the things my partner said in extension as like different things, rather than trying to like synthesize them together into this set of issues and this set of issues and this set of issues. And I think generally, depending on the type of debate that you're in, it's usually slightly preferable, if you can, to summate thematically rather than by team. But if you find yourself struggling to draw together like little arguments from teams here and there to kind of group them argumentatively, it's better to just do it by team. I do, however, think even if you're doing a thematic summary, particularly if you are the gov whip, it is useful to just have everything you think you're going to say in your whip about opening up, about opening gov, about your extension, just prepared, ready, and done by the time, like by the end of your own extension speaker, which means you can listen. You can just sit and just listen. You're not writing anything about the rest of what you're going to say. You're just going to sit and listen to member of op, and you're going to work out what rebuttal that they've given to your extension you need to deal with, and you can write that down in the sort of like, in the bits of paper that you've kind of set aside for whipping your partner's material. You can like write in the sort of bits of rebuttal that the other side gave, and then your rebuttal to that. So also the other thing is when I'm writing my whip speeches, I always leave huge quantities of space. So like you just use loads of paper because you're writing like having enough space such that, my partner made this argument, and then if closing up makes some clever bit of rebuttal, I can write in like sort of what their rebuttal was, and then after that I can write in what my response is. So having lots of space on your paper is useful for that. But then going back to the original structure, you then have all of their sort of substantive extension material you can just deal with in a neat package. And if it's sort of very linked and close, sort of like directly oppositional to some of the other things other teams have talked about or clashes with them, I think it's fine to point out that it does. I think if you are less experienced and try and sort of fold that whole new extension, if you're GovWork speaker, you try and fold in everything op member said into a like thematic summary that you've sort of thought about for the other three teams in the debate, you are much more likely to miss things that may end up being particularly important later on. I think often when you're, if they have a good whip, they will probably then go, haha, you didn't really rebut these three arguments, and it turns out they were actually the most important arguments the whole time for the reasons that I probably knew that I'm going to say in whip, but I'm sort of allowed to do so. So you want to make sure you're doing a relatively thorough demolition job of CO, and it's useful to put that separately. Similarly, if you're op whip, I think it is useful to set aside like a dedicated period of your whip to just explicitly and aggressively dealing with to closing gov. Your partner is likely to have done some of the rebuttal already, so you don't need to repeat it. You can just point out that it has been made, unless they have made some useful responses to that rebuttal, and then you can do so. But it is still useful to make it absolutely clear to the judge that you are engaging very directly. You're engaging with the premises of their debate. So that's probably how you generally tend to approach structure. One other question you had was sort of how do you group stuff? Like, I think, so in any debate, when you stand up to whip, if it's a 7-minute, speech, you've had about 50 odd minutes of talking before you. You clearly cannot deal with absolutely everything that's been said. So you're going to have to make a lot of decisions about which things to bother including, which things to bother rebutting. And I think in terms of thematically, the best way to look at it is to sort of, what are the burdens that either side have? What things do we need to prove in order to win from this particular position on the table in this debate? And work out where teams made important contributions to those things. It is likely that in any given clash, probably all three teams said, or all three other teams said something about it, probably. It is your job as a whip speaker, particularly as a good whip speaker, to think about which of those contributions were the most useful. In the same way that you would as a judge, think about what is the actual sort of deciding factor in this clash? That is the thing you want to go after most aggressively in your whip, in your rebuttal, in your framing, whatever, to explain why your extension has won this thing. So I'm not sure there is necessarily an easy sort of trick to how you group things together. In part, it's going to just depend on whatever the debate is. But you can probably go in already thinking on any given motion, there's probably going to be a bunch of arguments broadly about this, a bunch broadly about that. And as the debate goes on, you'll be thinking, where these arguments have fitted in and which ones of these I actually ought to care about as a whip speaker. So next thing people were asking about is, how do you explain why your arguments beat sort of other teams, particularly your opening? So this, I think, is probably the trickiest thing to do in whip, but is probably one of the things you should always leave until last. I think it is much easier, just sort of, and maybe this is a personal thing, but most people I've talked to who do whipping find as well, it is almost always easier to beat a team that is opposite you, whether they're the closing or the opening, because you can just rebut them. You can't really rebut your opening, and there are ways you can get around trying to do so, and often it's probably just true that the more debating you've done and the funnier you are as a speaker, the more you can get away with just being that was obviously rubbish, but it's fine, it's part of the game, guys. But you can't really aggressively rebut them, whereas you can, you're the two teams on the other side of the bench. So the first thing I'd say about that is if you think that it is going to be difficult for you to do, then just don't spend too much time trying to think of this really complicated, clever weighing mechanism and spending loads of your time thinking about how you're going to deal with that. Actually, you're better off spending your time and your energy and your whip making sure you're beating the two teams opposite you, and then worst case scenario, you're going to get a second. And the other thing is, in terms of weighing, like, obviously you want to do explicit weighing. So you want to be explaining, there are ways you can do this, explaining why your arguments are better than your openings. But also, to a certain extent, a lot of judges will just sort of do it by themselves. They will just have an opinion about which of these two arguments seems better. And they'll be like, well, closing didn't really give us a weighing mechanism, but like their argument was pretty well analysed, and it is new and it is different. So like, unless it's very close, then like if you've comprehensively beaten the op bench in your closing gov, and the opening gov like was sort of like a bit sketchy in terms of their opening half, then like most judges are probably going to give you the win without you even trying to come up with some super clever reason why your arguments are more important than theirs. That said, you should probably still try. And I think there are ways you can do this. And a lot of them are sort of... So from what Steve was talking about earlier, about the ways in which you can generate an extension, I think that thought process is the exact same thought process you should be using when weighing arguments. So if your extension, fills a particular logical gap in the openings case, and that is the reason why you have made that extension, you point that out and you walk the judges through. Here is what Opening Gov said. They said that having poor people in rich neighborhoods will increase interaction between these two communities, and that interaction will lead to this set of positive outcomes. And you say, we agree entirely with opening government that it will lead to interactions, and that a positive interaction will be a good thing. The problem was opening government never told us why those interactions are likely to be positive. What we did in extension was give you 4 reasons why those are likely to be positive. What were they? And then you go, reason 1, reason 2, reason 3, 4. And like probably this is the point where you might bring in, and closing op said this as a response to one of those points, but here is our counter response, or way that is true. So in a way, I think actually a lot of your how do I weigh my argument versus my opening should have been done for you, because you have explicitly chosen an extension that fulfills some criteria that is useful in that clash. So opening have just only talked about how this affects one group of people, but have just completely ignored another group of people. And you can be like, opening didn't talk about these people at all. We're going to explain, why we should care about these people, why we care about them more than the other set of people that opening talked about. And I think that's the kind of thing that you can leave to whip and you don't really need to do in extensions so much. So explaining why, the things that the team and your ahead of you said are contingent on some other things that you improved is one way you can beat them. Another way you can beat them is just being like, they had some harms, we had some harms, our harms are bigger, is the easiest way you can do it. The second one is more likely. So you will have, and this is something that people do, they will pick like a very small harm that like probably doesn't matter that much, but you can show very concretely why it's likely to happen. So you play the game of saying, look, opening had all these giant harms, which sounded really bad, but as opening op pointed out, like, it's not really clear how likely they are to happen. And we're not really sure in closing government whether they will or won't happen. But what we are absolutely sure about is that this harm definitely is going to happen, and it definitely matters. And even if it only affects a small number of people, or even if it's only like a small effect, like that alone we think is reason enough to not do this debate. And I think it's often when you're doing a very marginal extensions, that's when there's more scope to arguing through being like lots of emotive language, or like this might seem like a really tiny impact on minority group X, but actually like the summations of this coupled with all the other disadvantages these people have is actually really significant. And given that we absolutely know this is going to happen, we should not do this policy, regardless of any like potential positive impact in some other sphere that are unquantifiable and not even likely. We know this is going to happen, and it is bad, and therefore we shouldn't do this policy. So just kind of like pretending everyone else in the debate hasn't really done their jobs and all their stuff is all like spurious and yours is super grounded, if tiny, is also another sensible weighing mechanism. And then I think those are probably sort of the main methods that you'll go through. And the trouble is, I think there's no real sort of like one-size-fits-all policy to like, this is how I will always weigh my arguments versus theirs. Chances are it will always depend on the debate. But you can nonetheless take some proactive steps. And this is why what we were talking about earlier in prep time matters so much. So making sure that the extension that your partner is going to give is one that addresses lots of issues that are really central to the debate and fixes a problem in opening half or introduces a whole new set of harms that no one has talked about that you can say are really important for whatever reasons. The other advantage you always have in closing is that there's just way less time for your arguments to be scrutinized and rebutted, particularly if you're closing op. Closing op have a sweet deal in VP, which is the extension can stand up and just talk for like 7 minutes and give a huge quantity of arguments, and then they have one speaker to respond to them who's also trying to juggle that with a whole bunch of other things. And then if you're op whip, you just come up and be like, okay, they didn't respond to half of our stuff. You know, here is why all of that stuff was really important and therefore debate winning. So, yeah. What other questions did people have, particularly about whipping?
Do you think there's any utility to, not necessarily rebutting, but if a team has failed to prove something that is important, to just point that out, as opposed to adding on more information why it's also actively incorrect?
I always think you should do the former. So if you think a team has claimed a thing is likely to happen, but haven't proved it, the first thing you do is you point out that, like, look, they said this was going to happen, but give us basically no reason for it other than whatever one line they probably just asserted. You point out that this was the case. You probably, I think you can do these things in threes very effectively. You point out that they made an assertion, or that, like, if maybe it was an assertion, there was just like one very flimsy link, and you explain why. I think you can do quite quickly. You can explain why, because often it's logically relatively intuitive that the rest of their argumentation relies on that thing being true. So you point out that it's flimsy, you give a response to whatever it is that they have said, and then you come up with a reason why actually the inverse is probably true. So even if you think that, like, in the real world it's probably a bit of a stretch, you can just, in debating, you can get away with saying almost anything. So you just be like, actually we think the opposite is equally likely to be true for some reason. As long as you put in equivalent amounts of time, or even ever so slightly more time, like, the judges are going to be pretty, like fair enough. So we've used this example a few times already, but if in the social housing debate, it is all just like, there'll be interactions and they'll necessarily be good, and it will lead to this set of harms. If you're on op, you point out they just asserted that these interactions are likely to be good because you'll meet them at the shop and you'll be friends with them. Rebut, be like, chances are, given that these people are going to be priced out of most of the amenities in these areas, you're not even going to have those interactions. Actually, these interactions are likely to be much more negative given the context that they're likely to be in for reasons A, B, C. And then, that's 20 seconds where you've just, like, aggressively pointed out that a whole bunch of, opening Gov's case is contingent on them proving a thing that they haven't proved. And you've given a plausible alternative reading. And then that is the point where you can actually go, yeah, I don't actually need to spend huge amounts of my whip dealing with opening Gov anymore, because I've already sort of pushed them very much out of the debate. Although, nonetheless, that is the kind of time where you'd also be like, so we don't actually think any of their impacts that they say are going to happen are likely to happen. But, for argument's sake, let's say some of them do, and then you do them very quick, like one or two liner rebuttals to the actual harms that they said were going to happen once you've already said, like, you kind of like try and frame them out by being like, your case relies on this one thing that you haven't proven. Here is why that is not true. Therefore, the rest of your arguments don't stand. But let's assume they do. Let's play the game. Here are some rebuttals to those anyway, and then done. And I think that is often the most effective way you can deal with a team as a whip speaker, because there are so many arguments on the table. If the big portion of their case, even if they have one or two other things, if the big portion of their case can be explained as relying on a particular thing, and you can rebut that, and you can be much more efficient in working out which sort of parts or lines of the case I need to rebut in order that I can save myself a lot of time rather than having to go through the whole thing. And so these are the kind of things you can get away with as well in whip, because no one expects you to give full line-by-line rebuttal to absolutely everything the other side has said. So framing teams out with clever rebuttal is also very helpful. And I think what you can do, and what you will, as you get more advanced, what you'll find yourself doing, and what more advanced speakers do, is that the sort of rebuttal framing of here is the frame as to why that argument was dumb or didn't make sense or was contingent on this sort of thing, is also usually the same frame that you're using to explain why your extension fixes that. So you can do one bit of framing that works for multiple purposes, which is, this is why OG are dumb and are out of the debate, but this is also why we have won the debate, because we have proven the thing, we have proven the inverse of the thing that their case relies on, conclusively wins you that clash. And if you point out that a lot of ops responses were also contingent on proving that inverse, then you're like, okay, with one clever bit of framing, I have beaten both open and half teams, and then I just need to think of a way to fit CG somewhere into that. And maybe you can just rebut them directly and go after them. That's also very sensible to do. So I think you always want to balance these things. Framing is good, rebuttal is good. Do both of them. Mitigate everything they say. Probably not true. Probably not important. Probably not likely to happen. If you do those three things to the core of each team's arguments, and you have some decent reasons as to why, then you're already going to be putting yourself in a very strong position. And then once that's all done, and you've sort of done everything else in the debate, not important, then it is your time to do your extension to explain why that has won the debate.
Two questions. How do I weigh things? And then second one, how do I weigh the classic principles versus consequences?
How do you weigh things? By making new arguments. So you say, these people said we should care about women, these people said we should care about poor people. And then you go, let's think about this. Probably, statistically, 50% of poor people are women. I don't know. So, you generally have to sort of enter that. This is where most of the sort of new content in a whip comes in, is that is something that you need to, because for any set of arguments of how do I weigh argument A versus B? How do I show which is more important or we should care about more? It is possible to construct reasons that say A is more important than B. It is equally possible to construct reasons that says B is more important than A. And so it is your job as a whip speaker, the main sort of extra substantive contribution you're doing is trying to think about clever ways that are quite intuitive, that don't require the judge to think too much to say, we should just care about this more than that. So, some things will crop up time and time again, like short-term impacts versus long-term impacts. And depending on which side of the debate you're on, you can do either of those relatively easily by being like, look, the long term is all fine and good, but these short-term harms cause huge amounts of distress to all these people literally right now. They are more plausible, more tangible. The sort of long-term picture is going to be affected by both this policy and any myriad of other policies that we can't necessarily predict. Therefore, we should care about what we know to be true, and that is our side. Equally, the sort of inverse of the long-term harms are really important can be something like we are perfectly willing to sacrifice some kind of short-term benefits such that, or take on some short-term harms such that in the long term we get a large amount of benefits because, like, you know, it just affects more people. It is the only way we can fix this. If we don't incur these short-term harms, then we get an equivalent number of harms permeating for the long term, which seems intuitively plausible. So it really just depends on whatever the arguments in the debate are making, and that is your job as your main contribution as the whip in terms of your analytic contributions to the debate are going to be thinking of reasons. So if you need to weigh two arguments, then you go, okay, can I construct some reasons, some logical reasons from first principles? Is it a greater amount of harm? Does it affect more people? Do we in this debate have a special duty to this particular set of people? Are the harms more likely to occur? Do they occur over a longer period? Like, all of these things, I think there are lots of different tacks you can go down in terms of weighing one argument relative to another, but it is your job to construct a metric and then justify that metric in whip, and that is I think the skill that is something that you need to develop that will separate like good whip speakers from less good whip speakers who just say, and our argument is more important than their argument because of something. You're like, well, that's not a reason, you've just said it was more important than theirs. Whereas a better whip speaker will construct a reason, often something that, like, you know, in an ideal world, extension speaker might have said some of these things, but like equally it's totally fine if they don't, as long as they've said the argument. If you and whip explain why that argument matters so much, and you, as long as you're not giving new sort of reasons why that argument is true, you're just giving sort of ways of thinking about this argument in the context of the debate, it's absolutely something you can bring in. Principles versus consequences is, I just think, a particular example of this. Like, I don't think there is, it probably depends what principles we're giving up for what consequences. And so, like, do you, off the top of your head, do you have a particular example or thought in mind?
Let's just go the Best Worlds final, but trying to have the consequences be the actual principle.
I mean, well, so it's just, there is no real way to adjudicate those things, is the problem. And so this is where debating strays perhaps it's furthest from pretending to be a meritocratic objective activity. Certainly you can do better, but it really depends on what the principles are, what the consequences are. If you can explain that the consequences are so awful that they impede on some other set of principles that people like. So, for example, you know, like, you know, so perhaps one thing you could say, I think one of the things that, like, you know, closing, sort of opening up in that final, like, just kind of made jokes about it, like, this is basically just everyone is going to die, and OG were like, ah, it's totally fine, like, at least they'll be free, sort of thing, is like a, you know, super, like, in that sort of debate, I think, you know, explaining things that, like, you know, the set of principles that one side cares about so much, freedom, autonomy, whatever, is actually probably better fulfilled in a world where we don't have all these negative consequences. Like, probably some people get, like, the opportunity to self-determine at the expense of a huge number of other people, and given the inevitable failure of that self-determination, it's not clear that, like, it is that valuable, or, like, beyond, like, maybe some people would find it valuable, but it's just not intuitively true that everyone would be willing to, like, I'm going to start a revolution because I want to, even if I then get killed, tortured, and, like, starve. So I think that is the kind of things where you just, as a speaker, like, you're just relying on the intuitions of people and trying to explain things in the way that is most, like, damning to the other side and most beneficial to your side. I don't think there is a right or wrong way to weigh up principles versus consequences, and often, depending on which side of the debate you're on, you're going to be arguing for one versus the other. I don't think, I think it is often much easier to explain why consequential arguments matter in debating. And so if you are making the principled case, you have to just go, like, super, super go hard or go home. And this is probably a thing that is like, I think happens a lot in finals. This is why like most debating finals seem to end up, unless there's like a big disparity in the quality of the teams, you almost always see OG or CO winning, because it is so difficult. If OG just stand up and say, we are fine with literally everyone dying in eternal torment because of this one principle, and we're going to just talk about it for 40 minutes, then it becomes very difficult for an op team to, like, you're just kind of framing out every possible consequential argument, and then you're taking the debate into the real abstract, which most judges are, I think, quite bad at judging, and just end up relying on their own kind of general worldview of beliefs about the world. So if you can keep the debate in consequential grounds and make good consequentialist arguments, you are probably more likely to do well. So I think generally, if you can make a really, really good principled argument and you can do it really well, yes, that can win you the debate outright, but more often than not, you will just make a not great principled argument, which will rely on some intuitions. Someone on the other side will point out a competing set of intuitions, and the judge will go, I'm not really sure how to adjudicate this, so we'll call that a draw. I'll just default back to pragmatics. I guess one side just kind of stuck on their principle, and the other side, as well as being like, your principle is dumb, gave a bunch of like arguments, like consequentialists. It's also just generally, I think, much easier to prove a principle is like not incorrect, but not necessarily true, than it is to provide a positive, like, rationale for a principle. It's so much easier to just be like, well, they said we should care about this principle, but here is a competing principle, without actually ever bothering to rebut the first thing. You just be like, I don't know, I don't care, so consequences. And most people will be like, yeah, okay, fair enough. So, like, as a rule, principled arguments are really hard to make. So, like, I would be hesitant to try and make those big parts of your case. But yeah, you can do if you want to, and like, as we have seen, it can win you Worlds finals. But like, I think thinking about debating in terms of what would or would not be effective in a final is often not the best way to think about it, because often what is true in a final is not true for the very many rounds preceding it. Any more questions? Everyone's very dead. Everyone's very tired.
I think that's because it was just after lunch, so yeah.
Okay, so maybe for like the last little bit then, let's play a game. So let's construct a game about winning. Okay, so let's have, how many people have we got? 1, 2, 3. Okay, we've got 3 threes. So let's have you 3 can be a team, and you 3 can be a team, and you 3 can be a team. So I'm just going to think of a random motion, and then I want you guys to prep close and gov. You guys can prep closing off. You guys can also think of closing gov. I just want you to sort of prep me a set of extensions. So we're going to start, I'm going to give you like, let's say like 7 minutes from now to just prep a series of potential extensions on a motion. And you can all be, what motion shall I give you? Okay, a classic. This house would ban private healthcare.
Oh, Matt, should I stop recording at this point?
Yeah, probably.